Yes, my name's Andrew Gray. I live in Harrogate, and I've just recently stood in Selby and Ainsty, in the Selby and Ainsty by-election on July the 20th, and I was using AI to create my policies. And if I was elected, which sadly I wasn't, I would have continued to use AI to sort of harvest the views of this massive constituency, which goes from North Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, East Yorkshire. It's a strange constituency. I was going to harvest their views, and I was going to vote in Parliament in accordance with the consensus.
That's a very innovative way of doing that. So how did you get that across to the voters? What was your pitch to the voters for that?
It was very simply that I was the AI-powered candidate, and probably the first in the UK and possibly the first in the world to use AI in an election. And I didn't win. I came 11th out of 13th, but I sort of dominated like national news, local news, and also lots of international news were interested because it was a first.
And what's the name of the AI you were using?
The technology is called Polis. I think it's open source technology. Lloyd will probably do a better job of explaining it than me, but my understanding is copylefted technology, so anybody can pick an instance up, which is what I've done previously, or through Lloyd's company, we've done that, and we've made it anonymous and essentially let people vote on particular issues for their village or their town or their general political views, and then use that to find consensus points and then create a manifesto on the back of those points. And in fact, the Daily Mail, Richard, demanded an exclusive for the manifesto, and they put it on page 2 of their newspaper as well.
Wow.
on a website, and I got hundreds of comments, mostly negative, but that's possibly because the manifesto it spat out was really quite progressive, like quite pro-European and pro-wind turbines and whatnot, which is kind of where British people tend to be.
Right, I bet the Daily Mail loved that, didn't they?
I'm with him. In fairness, I'm going to they didn't know what was going to come out of it, but they printed it regardless, actually, and it wasn't a hatchet job. It was totally fair, and they gave it massive prominence as well. So there was no criticism of the policies from the editors. Actually, I was okay with it.
I suppose that puts the Daily Mail in a tricky position, doesn't it? Because it's crowdsourced in that kind of way. They can't really knock it, can they? Because they're just going, this is not a political party that's made this, so they can't go, it's biased one way, left or right or centre or wherever. This is what people actually think. So they would be in a really tricky position criticising that, I guess.
Exactly. And also every other candidate was in difficulty criticising it. In fact, anybody was in difficulty criticising because it wasn't me, and they couldn't sort of besmirch or attack me as the person. I would say that people didn't like the idea of AI in politics because they left them feeling cold and leaderless and like almost like it was without morality. I think people sensed it that way, but there was no criticism really from anybody, candidates, media, individuals, as to really the policies that it created, because I think they could see that actually they were all kind of logical. It hung together and weren't really wacky.
Okay, yeah, I guess that's one of the we've all heard about the flipping. What was the boat called? Ultimate Boat Face. That was the one where
Yes.
the public voted for it, and they go Ultimate Boat Face. That I'm sure there's some sort of filters that can kind of smooth all that kind of thing out. I would hope.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you would think the Daily Mail would also find it interesting, just from a perspective of selling newspapers, wouldn't you? Because it is so sourced in such a consensual way.
Yeah, and with AI being the big kind of keyword at the moment, everyone's frightened to death of AI. There's a lot of scaremongering about it. And this is one of those things where I think it's actually probably really useful, and we get it a lot in marketing about AI. People are frightened to death that AI can write all your blog posts and your everything else, but actually, you can't run away from it. It's just finding its right uses, I think, is the key. And this to me sounds like a really, really good one.
Mm-hmm.
So, Royd, what was New Redo's involvement in all this?
So it's been an interesting project right from the start. I think it was, when Andrew first came to us with his idea and introduced us to the Polis platform. you know, the first thing we needed to do was just kind of get something up and running, really. So Polis is an open source project. It was written over on the west coast of the States. Um, I think it's been a labour of love at some time, and has been, you know, in and out of active development. So we got something up and running when we first launched it, or we first got something kind of in, you know, just running in a test environment. It was clear it had some issues. So we worked with the team to fix a whole bunch of stuff, and submitted those changes back in you know, in the spirit of open source, an open source project. Submitted those changes back to the project. um, because of the nature of it, and you know, the kind of the as I say, it's been in and out of being in active development. It took a while for those changes to get merged back into the project, but I think they all have been now. We've continued to run it and support it. It's you know, you know, it's, generally speaking, it's been, you know, very positive, very solid. Um, you know, it's been, you know, just been easy to look after, really.
Okay, and how's it kind of held up with it being open source? How's it held up with the kind of robustness of the input that Andrew's probably driven to do it? Is it managed
Do you know
all
what?
that?
Do you know? It's yeah. I mean, we had a few little meetings before the campaign started, and Andrew talked to us about his plans, and we kind of got some contingency in place, and you know, just kind of tried to get our ducks in a row as from a kind of disaster resilience point of view. But to be honest, none of those none of those things were needed. It's ran flawlessly, to be honest with you. It's just been great, really. You
I
know,
agree.
it's had a lot of traffic, and it's been great.
Fabulous. So Andrew, how did you go about kind of pitching this to the people of Ainsty? Because obviously this is something that the people have never really looked at before. I've never come across anything like this. It's always been people with leaflets through the door. Or I remember actually when I was in Greece last week, there must be some sort of local election or something. There was a guy in a car with a loudspeaker on the top, kind of shouting, which is really old school politics. I remember those going through the streets with kind of people going, vote for Labour or Conservative, whatever colour you want to put on. But nothing like this. So how did you get the public to interact with that?
Well, buy a megaphone, and I did buy a sandwich board that you could write on. But for health reasons, and also the fact I didn't have enough guts, I didn't actually get around to using them.
Oh, that's a shame.
They must be remembered that the Selby and Ainsty constituency, just remember, is absolutely vast. It touches, I said, every bit of Yorkshire, and it has essentially about 100 villages and 3 towns. And because this was a by-election and not a general election, you didn't know it was going to happen. So I wasn't like planning to do this. It was opportune, and I live just north of the constituency, like 3 miles away from the borders. In fact, to drive the constituency is more like about an hour and a quarter to drive across it, which is, yeah. So how could, as an independent who doesn't have a party, get the message out fast enough to everybody? And that was a big challenge. What you might not know is if you pay your £500 deposit to the council to stand, and you get people sign your paperwork, the Royal Mail then will deliver 1 leaflet to every single household for you for free. So there was 50,000 houses, and say first class stamp, what is it, about £1? So you save, for £500, you get £50,000 worth of Royal Mail, which is a bit of a deal. And actually the leaflets aren't that expensive. So every house received a leaflet. So there was that, and that was fine. Only little leaflet, only small ones. I could only do 1 drop, but there wasn't enough to do any more than that. So therefore, the data that I was getting wasn't targeted particularly from a particular socio-economic group. It was every household got the same thing. Second of all, I used Facebook, and Facebook were so difficult to deal with for pushing anything political because of the problems with Brexit and Cambridge Analytica. I wanted to spend, I'm happy to share it on this with you all. I wanted to spend £3,000 in the first week because I needed to generate momentum. And I was hoping I was going to get lots of donations in from sort of tech entrepreneurs around the country, because anyone could bankroll the campaign up to 100 grand. But Facebook only let me spend about £10 in the first week. They put like barriers on it.
Yes.
So you had to send them passports and driving licenses and letters from the council. And then they would check every ad because it was political. And you weren't allowed to target it other than in a geo-located way. So you couldn't say you wanted to hit, say, Guardian readers between the age of 30 and 35 with a degree in that area. You weren't allowed to do that. It'd just be geo-targeted. And again, because the area is so big, like it was just difficult, because if you focused on near Wetherby, so Wetherby isn't in the constituency, but areas around it are, then you potentially got people voting on your platform
that aren't in the constituency. Right.
Exactly. So it was a massive problem with using Facebook and Instagram for that effect. Twitter worked better, but that's international, so you really don't think that many people know Selby and Ainsty on Twitter or X as it is now using that. I used TikTok a lot as well. I found TikTok was the easiest way to speak to people. Again, you're speaking to people around the world, and I just pick up my phone and do a like quick 1 minute raw, awful little video, but it would have like thousands of views like within like half an hour or so. That was quite useful. And then LinkedIn was quite good as well, although again the reach is international and you have to deal with lots of comments, of which when you suggest something so radical as AI in politics, and you also say that the job of the MP is to be like a lawyer, and I'm a lawyer, we should take our instructions from the constituents, and that's the job. And now we've got the technology to listen to the constituents, a bit like that, the client listening to the lawyer listening to the client. If you suggest something radical, you are going to get panned with comments. And broadly speaking, I did. And so I did get lots of comments on like Facebook and stuff when we were pushing ads out. And most of them were actually negative, I'd say. They were saying, well, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? And you're like, well, I don't believe it's my job to tell you what I think about a particular issue in a particular town. You should be telling me what to say. And it's a difficult thing to say to everybody that they have got it they've got it wrong for their entire lives, that it isn't that I am right and they are wrong. Is a really challenging marketing message to send. But I also used the local press, which was pretty good and fair. The BBC was horrendous and biased, and that was the big learning point for me. And then when it came to the national press, it was probably more the right-wing press who were more interested in it than the progressive left-wing press. And internationally, it was picked up by all sorts of organisations, and there was podcasts and this and that. But the BBC was the most difficult one to work with, and actually explains why the votes were low. I think in part because the BBC say, well, you didn't stand last time, you're not in a party, therefore we're going to give you no air. And therefore, essentially, what the public is seeing is they think that you're not trying or you can't win, because if the BBC haven't picked you as someone to be interviewed on Newsnight or anything, well, the public will be sewed into their heads, well, no, they can't win, particularly in a by-election when the government's unpopular. You need to suggest that you're the alternative to the government. And if the BBC won't regard you as such, the people won't, and you're knackered.
It's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because that this makes a lot of good points about politics. And generally, it is kind of rigged between the two-party system, because that's kind of what it is. They are doing it because they've got their own ideas, whereas the whole point of Parliament, and I think I'm going to put words in your mouth, but this is the whole point of standing for Parliament, is to represent your constituents, isn't it?
Yes.
And their wants and needs and etc. etc. And that's almost the antithesis of what members of Parliament generally, I'm not going to put them all in that bag, but generally do. They're out for their own gain to a large or small degree. I'm being as very diplomatic as possible here. So yeah, it's interesting that there's been such a knockback, especially to me as well. It seems a bit backwards from what you said. If the left leaning press didn't feature it much, but the right did, and then the BBC didn't really touch it, that's not really computing for me. But
I wondered because
I'm just going to say independents have been. The only independent I can remember that was featured regularly on TV. I'm trying to think of his name now. I think
Martin Bell.
Martin Bell, the guy in the white suit.
Martin Bell in Tatton in 1997. I'm reading his book at the moment, Lloyd.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Yeah, and I don't know whether whether it was because he was a journalist and they liked him, like presumably.
Well, presumably he knew the people in the newsroom to speak to get me on the news.
Well, it wasn't that reason actually. If you, it was in Tatton, which is where my parents live, and it was because Neil Hamilton purportedly had taken
Oh,
money
yes.
from Ahmed Al Fayed, purportedly,
Yeah.
and therefore all the other candidates stood down other than Neil Hamilton versus Martin Bell. So that was he had fame on his side and media, as you say, but he also was corruption versus the white suit.
The man in the white suit, yeah. It's that whole Western
Right.
thing, is it? The sheriff comes in with his white hat on. That was where you could also was the sheriff in the black and white cowboy film. The sheriff had the white hat on.
And you had your sandwich boards, Andrew.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But
Exactly.
if I may say so, polis, the word polis comes from the Greek city-state where democracy originally came from. And if I can, the theory behind polis is a really simple one, is when democracy was first originated in ancient Greece, so free men, so not slaves and not women, would listen to a debate and they'd have a pebble, a white pebble, a black pebble, and they'd vote. They'd listen to every debate and they would vote. And a decision would be made like that. But it's only when cities became too big and the issues too complicated and too many people, they couldn't all listen to the debate. So the whole point of polis is now we can listen to what everybody thinks. Democracy should go back to how it actually its initial founding principles. And so that's the name Polis, and that's the logic behind it.
Right, okay. So Lloyd, sorry.
And so it's not also, if I may, as well, it's the people worry about the tyranny of the majority. They'll say, well, the Nazis came to power through the ballot box and whatnot. But you must remember, this technology is looking for consensus. It's the antithesis of social media. Social media pours petrol onto disputes that aren't often there, and the national media suggests that we're all some culture war with each other. But really, if you then go and talk to someone in a pub, you realize mostly you agree with them about most things, or when you're at some sorts. It's only online where everybody seems polarized. And when you use Polish, you realize actually we're not that polarized. We mostly get on with each other. And if you could find those points, if you're using data, you would always get elected using this method if all things being equal and you had a team of people behind you and you were in a party and BBC were fair to you, you'd have a manifesto which was powerful. You would always win this way. Obviously, I didn't, but that's the first one.
So that brings me nicely on to a question I wanted to ask Roy. Was obviously data can do anything. I've seen data sheets, and you can spin data however you want. You can spin it left, right, and center, literally. So how does Polis and the work that you did with the open source software, how does that manage the points that Andrew's making there about the fact that it could be hijacked and we could end up in that ultimate boat face point? How does it? I mean, it's difficult, isn't it?
How does it prevent
You
that?
don't want it to flatten that curve, because that's kind of the point. You need a consensus. So you don't want it to flatten the curve, so you get non-policies. So how does it come to some sort of sensible consensus?
So Polis has has a range of kind of machine learning and AI. You might call it AI techniques for kind of clustering data and such like which help the presentation things. But at its core, I think it's quite an elegant model in so much as it's a very simple, elegant model in that you can seed it with some statements, and when voters or when anybody partaking looks at those statements, they have an option to, if they agree with something, to vote it up. But crucially, they don't have an option to vote something down. So so if you don't agree with a statement, then what you do is try and replace it with something that you do agree with and propose another statement. So I think that so actually to sort of be a troll, I mean, it's not really possible to be a troll without, I don't know, going to a lot of work anyway, at least. So it's a very simple, elegant model. So over time, generally, the consensus floats to the top, and anybody being too negative will tend to disappear into oblivion quite quickly. So I think that at its core, that simple model is a really good one. Now, there's obviously some code underneath all that to kind of help that and help to visualize the results and help to improve or make it easier to interpret the results. But yeah, I think that Andrew's campaign is an indication of the kind of use it could be put to, and it's a very high profile, challenging, let's say, use of the technology. But I mean, I just think there are many possible uses for this approach to things. I've been, especially in business, really. I mean, even in, I think of all the things in, I'm a software engineer at heart that are divisive in software engineering. There's loads of things that are divisive in software engineering. I think of all the coding standards that have existed over the years, and to this day there are many that are that people use or don't use or argue about, um, and in many ways a lot of those kinds of things, the actual detail of something like a coding standard isn't that important. What's important is there's consensus around it, and what we're looking for is some consistency. And if everybody is using some kind of consistent, anything that's kind of standards based, perhaps is another example. Um, so I think there are many uses. Really, it's one of those technologies where there will be some innovative, creative uses that come out of the woodwork.
And how does it cope with things like a lot of things that are going on about AI at the moment are around kind of built-in bias, because the generative AI, so the ones we're all aware of at the minute, basically scrape old content, and they either rewrite stuff that they scrape from the internet, or they create images using other people's copyright, etc., etc. So how does Polis kind of cope with that in that in
Well,
in in
Polis
in that
isn't doing
way?
any kind of Polis isn't doing any kind of generative AI. Polis is more about trying to find similarities. It's like more of a closer to a similarity
Yeah,
engine. So I don't know if you know much about kind of vector databases and other forms of machine learning and AI. But that's really what it's closer to. Uh, as I say, the kind of thing that that Amazon do when Amazon suggests products that you might be interested in because you've
right.
already voted on another product by buying it.
Ah,
Um, but Polis isn't doing anything in that in that area. It's not doing anything that influences anybody using it. Really, that's
right,
just really about trying to help visualize what's for people trying to interpret the results. That's really more
right.
where that comes in.
So just to play devil's advocate, is it in the way that with social, so in my Facebook connections, I've now like kind of locked myself in this little bubble, and you don't kind of see out of the bubble, because it
Hmm.
recommends people, and in that kind of way where Facebook and Amazon will recommend people who you already know, who are probably quite similar to you, and Amazon will recommend, if you bought this product, here's another product that's very similar, and you end up in a kind of a little bubble. Is that a danger with this? And if how you described it, it kind of goes, well, if you like this, you like this. Is that a danger? And
Well, I
is there a
guess
danger
that's
in that this kind of flattening
yeah. Well, I mean,
the political debate?
is it it possibly is a day. It's a tool, isn't it? If you only talk to your close friends, then you're going to slowly adopt the opinions of many of your
Yeah.
close friends. I guess and that's nothing to do with AI. That's the human condition, is it
Yes.
not?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's I think maybe it's just being a little bit conscious of that. And yeah, the AI, the kind of AI that we're talking about here is really a tool to be able to see, how closely things might be related to each other in terms of when things are, their similarity may be fairly abstract.
Hmm.
Um, so what, in the early days of e-commerce, perhaps is the easiest example that people are familiar with. Um, I think that Spotify and Amazon, those kind of platforms, probably were a lot worse at with their recommendations than they are
Yes.
today.
Yeah.
And obviously they have got more than one agenda. Certainly I'm sure for all of them, they have more than one agenda of not just recommending things that that might be similar to something you've already bought, but they've also got a warehouse full of stock to shift. So
Yes, of
I'm
course.
sure there are other aspects to it
Yes.
as well. But in concept, it's a tool to be used, is it not? It's nothing to be really frightened of.
No, no.
Um, and where you might see two things that are obviously similar, we're talking about algorithmically being able to see the similarities between two things that may be more abstract.
Okay.
Which is, if you've got two statements made by constituents, let's say, how similar might those statements be?
Right.
Or and they may not be. They may or they may not be. Maybe sometimes it might depend on how you interpret that. So that's it's just a tool.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So, Andrew, what's the future of this AI and politics, do you think?
What's the future? Well, let me talk about a use case I've had before the election. So, one of my colleagues at the Crowd Wisdom Project, he worked with Wandsworth Council in London, and they wanted a Polis about clean air. Now, hands up who doesn't want clean air in their area. Obviously, everybody wants clean air, but then hands up who wants to get rid of their cars as well. So that's always a tricky one. So the London is an issue. So in Wandsworth, obviously London, they asked for a Polis, and they did a citizens' assembly beforehand, so that lots of people in person come together to then seed the Polis. And when they then distributed the Polis throughout Wandsworth, there was about 60,000 votes via the instance which is Royd is hosting. So there's 60,000 votes from about 600 people. So the average person in Wandsworth was voting 98 times on 98 different statements. Some people were doing 400 to 500 votes per person. So they were seeing an idea more in depth than they have probably ever considered anything in their entire lives. So let's go with the 98 as an average. So it's about clean air. You've voted either agree, disagree, or pass on average 98 times. Your mind has been expanded. You've educated yourself in the process. You can see the other side of the argument. And that is an awesome amount of data. So councils are already using it in our country. The government's already looking to use it. It's been used in Taiwan for the last 9 years or so. Other countries are far more advanced online when it comes to voting than we are. And so my theory is, my thesis is, and I don't find anyone who's disagreed with me about this thesis, and I'd love to know what you both think, is that our current voting system is you get a polling card or you vote by post with a piece of paper and a pencil, or on the day of the election you go to get the same thing, and again you've got a pencil on a piece of string, and you're in a voting booth and you cross and you put it in there. It's so anachronistic. If I say to everybody, do you think that's going to be the case in 10 years' time? Everybody's like, no, of course it's not. It's going to become more digital. And the question is it going to be ethical? Is it going to be transparent? Is it going to be fair? Is it going to be hackable? All of those things. So I suspect there's going to be massive investment by sort of third parties, so not governments, in this, because with governments, although they engage with it a little bit, they've always going to ask themselves the question, should we ever change the system that put us in power in the first place? I think that's the problem. But I do think the way I did it, and this is not to praise my logic, is I can see any independent candidate doing the way I've done it. Is, if you've got a profile in an area, if you've got a general election, so you've got like a much longer run up rather than 4 weeks, you might have 6 months or a year to have a run up at it. You collect all the data in your area and then you create the policies. Like, wow, like you could change the political system very quickly. And if we remember in France, I don't know that much about French politics, but Macron's party, who's been the president of France for however many 2 terms, came out of nowhere. It came in was it a year and a half? His party went from nothing to leader of France. So it is possible for someone to do something similar in the UK, but they probably need a quite high profile. Someone like a J.K. Rowling or Rory Stewart could easily take this and become the next prime minister, actually.
Well, I guess, is there, thinking of systems like that where there's lots of votes, correct me if I'm wrong, is it Sweden where they basically have lots of votes on lots of things?
Switzerland.
It began with an S. Yeah. I guess I guess it's kind of that thing that has to be built into the culture, in my opinion, because the British, being the British, are kind of like, oh, not voting again. And So at that point, do you end up with a consensus again from a smaller pool, because the larger population, just like you look at an election, a general election, you might get a 50% turnout, which is crazy when you think about it.
70% for a general. It's about
Okay.
45% when I stood.
Ah, okay.
But can I just follow the Switzerland thing? So Switzerland has
sure.
a referenda, like the Brexit referenda, where every person's vote counts, and they have lots of them, and their systems are quite complicated. So for us to the UK to get that way, you need massive constitutional change. To get massive constitutional change, you need lots of MPs to vote against the reason that got them there in the first place, constitutional change. The system I introduced essentially is actually you're voting like a Google review, a TripAdvisor review. You're up and down voting things in a sense. Like, you don't need any constitutional change to do this. And I did it without any constitutional change. I just wasn't elected. You can just easily see the case where a lot of people using the system then get into power who then constitutionally change it. So we have more frequent votings via our mobile phones.
I think it's got to be the way forward. I mean, you look at during the pandemic, when in Parliament they installed you could vote digitally, and then pandemic went and they went, oh no, now you've got to go through a corridor. You've got to stand in the corridor for 20 minutes or whatever, however long it takes to go through different corridors. It's madness, really, in 2023. It's crazy, and I presume it has been changed, but I do get your point about it's turkeys voting for Christmas, isn't it, in a lot of the ways, because it's not in their own interests to change the process.
And I think probably, for me, I suspect that the voter system is a reflection of also lots of the processes that happen in Parliament now. And I know obviously that things shouldn't change too quickly, because just because it's important that things slowly adapt. But I can't help but think they should change a little bit quicker than they maybe do at the moment.
Yeah, can I follow that thread?
I think we all agree.
I'm sure we do. But so Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, is two constituencies north from where I am. He's in Richmond, North Yorkshire, and I'm in Harrogate, North Yorkshire. And where I stood was sort of North Yorkshire, but the sort of south bit of North Yorkshire. Rishi Sunak was, he's very tech friendly. He spent a lot of time in California. He spent £3 million on a library out in one of the universities out there. And he's tried to make London the AI capital of the world. And whether you like Brexit or not, it doesn't matter what your view is on it, but it does make that we are able to stand away from Europe. Now, I was in Milan, Italy, about 4 months ago, and I was using ChatGPT to say, where should I go in Milan today? And then they cancelled ChatGPT. I couldn't use it in Italy. Wow. And I think in Europe, you're going to have that much harder regulation of technology. I think that's going to happen. Like, we had the Common Agriculture Policy, which dominated agriculture, whereas Britain's free of it. We are way more tech advanced than the rest of Europe by a million miles. And we've got a Prime Minister who absolutely loves it, who's also getting panned in the polls. So I do wonder whether actually the government, the Conservatives, might start to use it to actually find more appealing policies, actually. So it might be closer than you'd think, because as things stand, they're going to get wiped out unless they start finding consensus. So, watch your space, guys.